Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Nice to see you all at a very busy time of the semester. My name is Jeff Green, and I'm the director of the Andre Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy. And I want to welcome you here for our event, Encoding Race, New Tech, Old Inequalities. This event is part of a broader year-long series the Mitchell Center is conducting along with Perry Worldhouse on democracy and emergent technology. The purpose of our year-long series is to investigate the meaning for democratic values of the ongoing revolution in our technologies, to explore some of the opportunities and pitfalls that those new technologies are posing to us. And when we started meeting and planning well over a year ago for this series, the issue of race was at the forefront of our concerns. And we've touched upon it in some of our earlier meetings this fall, but today we are going to explore it head on. And I want to thank Anita Allen, a member of that planning committee, for encouraging us so much to pursue today's event, for helping to organize it, and for kindly agreeing to be its moderator. Anita is the Henry R. Silverman Professor of Law, as well as Professor of Philosophy at Penn. She's the author of over 100 articles and chapters, as well as numerous books, focusing on such topics as the philosophical dimensions of privacy and data protection law, women's rights, diversity in higher education, and other topics relating to ethics, bioethics, and legal philosophy. Many of us at Penn know her from her work as Vice Provost for Faculty between 2013 and 2020. She has too many accolades for me to review, so I would just note that in the last year alone, Anita received an honorary doctorate from Worcester College, was awarded the 2021 Philip L. Quinn Prize for Service to Philosophy and Philosophers by the American Philosophical Association, was awarded the 2022 Founders Award by the Hastings Center for Service to Bioethics, and was awarded the 2022 Privacy Award of the Berkeley Law and Technology Center for groundbreaking contributions to privacy and data protection law. It's a lot, yeah. Before turning things over to her, I want to just acknowledge Tom Shattuck and LaShawn Jefferson, who have been our partners at Perry Worldhouse in putting on the series this year. I want to thank them for all of their cooperation and work. And I also just want to acknowledge the other members of the planning committee besides Anita. They include Ellen Goodman, Michael Horowitz, Vijay Kumar, Jessa Lingell, Susan Lindy, Benjamin Shestakovsky, my colleague Matt Roth in the Mitchell Center, and Christopher Yu. So as we turn things over to Anita, I'll just tell you our next meeting will be January 19th, when we explore the technology of blockchain and the way it may or may not be democratizing finance. So keep your eye out for that as well. Anita, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so glad that we can meet in person, that so many of us are here together this afternoon. You know, very, very many marginalized and racialized groups around the world are experiencing extremes of surveillance and control by government and also in the hands of the private sector. And so as we look at this phenomenon around the world and we connect it to our ideas and concerns about racial capitalism and surveillance capitalism, we really understand we have a big problem. And we're going to be exploring that problem today. I was at Oxford University for a few weeks earlier this semester, and I met there a woman who is a member of the Uyghur Muslim minority community in China. And you know, I had, of course, read about the plight of the Uyghurs in the newspapers, and I was aware of the extremes of surveillance they're under, including extreme cell phone surveillance, but also surveillance on their mosque and in their homes. But to see a live person from that community and to hear her talk about her brother's incarceration on account of his political views, it was beyond impactful and moving. But this afternoon, on the theme of race and tech, we're going to be focusing on African Americans. We have two guest speakers who are going to help us to explore the relationship between technology, race, and African America. We have CHAZ Arnett, a professor of law from the University of Maryland, and Vice Provost CHARLTON MCILWAIN from NYU. And in this conversation we're going to be having, we'll be looking at Black Americans as programmers, coders, technologists, and tech entrepreneurs, but also as users and consumers of technology, and also as citizens and members of civil society whose constitutional, civil, and human rights are under threat in the digital economy. So let me just tell you a little bit about each of our speakers before we get started with our conversation. And I realize I left my glasses upstairs, so this is going to be really interesting. Okay. CHAZ Arnett is Associate Professor of Law at the University of Maryland, Carey School of Law, the other Carey Law School. He's an affiliate of the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies and a faculty fellow at Data and Society. His scholarship offers critical legal frameworks in challenging purportedly race-neutral laws and technologies. His most recent work focuses on examining the role that surveillance technologies play in perpetuating racial inequalities through policing and corrections. And I'm going to give a brief introduction, but please feel free to weave any other pertinent biographical facts into your remarks this afternoon. CHARLTON MCILWAIN is Vice Provost for Faculty Engagement and Development at NYU and Professor of Media, Culture, and Communications at NYU Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. His most recent work focuses on the intersections of race, digital media, and racial justice activism. Among his other contributions to the academic community, he runs a Center of Critical Race Thought and Technology at NYU. So please join me in welcoming both of our speakers. On Tuesday of this week, my students, several of whom are here, my students in my privacy and racial justice class, were treated to a chapter of your book, Black Software. Black Software, the book's subtitle is The Internet, Racial Justice from the Afronet to Black Lives Matter. And what I want to ask you about today are some of the salient features of the history that you tell in that book. What your book does is it tries to chronicle the long relationship between African Americans, computing technology, and the internet. So I want to ask you about some of the salient features of that history.
Absolutely. Thank you. I should probably always start, well, number one, with the caveat, which is I'm going to try to be short. I like talking about the book, and so thanks for giving the opportunity, and I'm going to try not to go on too long. I think for me, the joy and the interest in writing the book came from starting at one point and ending in a very different place than when I started. I started the book as a way to try to understand Black Lives Matter and to really try to understand the digital underpinnings of that movement. And so I had a little bit of a sense to know that things didn't sort of emerge out of nowhere in 2014, 2012, the moments we were talking about. And so I thought, well, I'm gonna go back a little bit to a place where this probably all started, which was maybe the dawn of the internet, or at least the internet that we know in the early mid-90s. And so that's where I started my journey. And I remember the day of meeting a guy named William Morrell, lived in Boston. And I started off all of my interviews with folks in a very predictable way. And that was just a conversation starter, which was, when did you first get online, right? And I thought I knew the answer to that question. It's a very easy one. But when I asked that to William, he kind of saw it for a second and then said, about 1978. And it was a moment when I thought, what the hell is he talking about? And so I asked William, what do you mean? And so long story short, what came out of that conversation was a pivot further back in history, discovering very different communities, but ultimately allowing myself to go back to the early 60s as a starting point. And that's when the substance of the book really changed from how do we explain Black Lives Matter to what has been the long relationship between Black folks and computing technology from its very beginnings. And that's where I discovered not only some people I never thought of in terms of entrepreneurs and creators who really powered the internet that we know it as today. But thinking about the first uses of computing technology, which was so much bound up with the question of race, blackness, black threat with civil rights. And so that origin story of race and technology was so intertwined, and for me, really helped to explain the journey of those two things from the mid-1960s all the way up through our present. I'll start. I can keep going.
Okay. Well, let me just pick up where you stop, and I'll ask you to keep going. But I want to keep going in a certain way.
Absolutely.
So you say in the book that Black people mastering tech tools, quote, has produced the most visible, sustained, and vociferous movement towards racial justice we've witnessed in the United States since the 1960s. I think that statement would surprise a lot of people.
I would think so, but if we think about it, and this is how I came to look at it, many of you are probably familiar with the various polls that we do and have done since the 50s, right? That ask questions at regular intervals. One of those questions being, what's the most important problem facing the nation? Typically happening during election cycles. And what you see sort of predictably is, as you reach the early and mid 1960s, race, criminal justice, racial inequality, discrimination, civil rights are all very, very high on that list, 1, 2, 3. Throughout the 60s and early 70s, by about 1971, it starts to drop off. By 1972, it's completely gone and never emerges again until about 2014 and 2015, directly tied to the moment when Black Lives Matter was really reaching its zenith. And so for me to see the amount of racial unrest that we've had between the late 1960s and the present, but not the sustained attention and a sustained place on the political agenda for issues of race and criminal justice in particular, until this moment and this movement that we knew as Black Lives Matter, which was very much a movement for racial justice, very much what I call a technology movement, though many of the folks that were really at the forefront of that movement often push back on that statement about the relationship of technology to that moment specifically.
Okay, you say technology's been used in an attempt to neutralize the felt threat Black people pose for American society. What's the threat that you think technology is trying to neutralize, or the use of technology is trying to neutralize?
So one of the wonderful things I liked about the book, different than our present, when we talk about things like threat, when we talk about the encroachment of technology on civil rights and civil liberties, we have to go through, and oftentimes great pains, to think through and identify where that comes from. The opaqueness of our technological systems are often an impediment to us trying to really understand how technology poses that threat to what it sees, in my view, as a threat from Black folks and other people of color. But when we go back to the 1960s, it was very transparent. And it happened in this way, which I'm sure we'll talk much more about later, which is you had an emerging threat in the 1960s, and it was very clearly Black folks protesting in the streets, this coming out in the form of violence, what the government and other people talked about as riots, civil disturbances. And this was a moment when Black folks were fighting for our humanity, our rights, a place at the table. And it was at this very same moment that white folks were looking out and seeing that and interpreting that in the lens of lawlessness, criminality, something that's been long associated, of course, with Black people. And this is a moment that we then say, and this happened through Lyndon Johnson and his famous law enforcement commission that he called into being, which was very explicit in saying, we have a threat, that threat is crime, and essentially crime has a Black face, and pointing out that Negroes at the time, primarily poor, primarily concentrated in urban areas, were the personification of this threat of crime that was pervading society in the view of him and primarily his white constituents. And so it was at this moment that in that commission's work, fairly early on, they turned to new computing technology. And so in the ultimate report of that commission, you see where they say, we have just now started to see the powers of this new computing technology. And he called on the commission, and particularly a science and technology task force that was part of that commission, to say, how can we put new computing technology to work to help us solve this problem of crime? The outcome of that, in a nutshell, is everything that we see today that pervades our society, from things like facial recognition to police saturation in Black and brown communities, to the varying ways in which the government, the state, continues to profile, to track, to criminalize, incarcerate Black people.
So I told my students I was going to ask you this slightly crazy question, but I will ask it anyway. The cover of your book. This book, Black Software, is published by Oxford University Press, very fancy press.
Indeed.
The cover has the Black Power fist on the cover, and I thought, wow, a book, Black Software is the title, the Black Power fist. Explain the choice of that image.
Thank you for asking that. It's really one of my favorite things to talk about with respect to that book, because it is it turned out to be a great cover. What I was trying to do with the cover, and folks here who have written books know you don't always have a choice and a say in what your cover ends up looking like. But I tried to really exert that because I wanted it to communicate really what my mindset was in thinking about what this book was about. And it had everything to do with both technology and power, and that ambivalence or the constant struggle between the two. And so that's where the fist came from, in using that metaphor of Black power. And then elsewhere, you can see in that visual the zeros and ones that are cascading down a screen. And so what I wanted to really communicate was something about Black people's centrality and power in technological context, even though it has not always played out in that particular way. That is to say that we are, as Black folks, have been, continue to be central in the landscape of technology development and use, and that our ultimate aspirations still revolve around mastering, having control, both over technology, but really over our own destinies. And that technology being a tool to either help make that happen, or something to push back and fight against, in as much as it is a threat to our ability to do that.
Thank you, thank you. I'm going to turn now to ask a couple of questions of Professor Arnett. Earlier today, some of us in this room heard a presentation by a lawyer from Kenya, who was discussing data in her country as the new oil. But you have written in a working paper about data as the new cotton. Data as the new cotton. Can you elaborate for us why you think that we can think of data as that old Southern crop cotton?
Yeah, everyone can hear me, right? Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the invitation. And let me just say, before I respond to the question, it's a pleasure to share the stage with two people whose work and impact that I truly adore and admire. So This is a great pleasure for me. So I have been, in thinking about data as the new cotton, and which I've been referring to for a couple of years now, because I've been writing and thinking a lot about surveillance technologies being used in the criminal justice system, particularly in policing and in the correctional context, which I generally refer to as sort of carceral surveillance practices and methods and ideologies, and even in sort of connected institutions like use of surveillance technologies in schools. And one of the things that kept bothering me, and I was trying to figure out, what was really bothering me was sort of the economic drivers at play, and sort of not only the sorts of technologies that were being funded, the areas and places where they were being experimented for, and then also sort of the latent justifications behind the need for certain technologies, particularly in the criminal justice context, i.e. we need this to keep Black and brown neighborhoods safe because they're violent. So I was thinking about sort of the economic levers and drivers behind this push for rolling out all of these technologies. And, and as a part of that, I was in discussions with people around the idea of surveillance capitalism, or what as Data for Black Lives refers to as data capitalism. This idea that companies are taking and extracting people's data without paying them, right? And I began to think about those processes and reflect on those discussions, and it struck me this idea of sort of extracting for the benefit of selling a commodity without paying the producers. And I said, this is eerily similar, to the racial capitalist logics, sort of the plantation logics, also sort of the narratives that are spun and justifying or sort of blaming those who are essentially the faces at the bottom of the well in that system. So in thinking about this mantra, data is the new oil, or data is the new gold, I thought that sort of reframing it as data is the new cotton spoke to a number of things, right? Obviously, it immediately evokes sort of race and disparity and subordination, which I think we should be thinking about and infusing in these discussions. But certainly in the American context, it was more so a response to the surveillance capitalism book that Professor Zuboff put out, in which she compares what's happening now with companies like Meta and Google and Amazon to what happened in terms of Ford Motor Company developing new ways of labor management and capital extraction, et cetera. And that's, in reading her book, I said, well, if we're looking for a more exact example, certainly in an industry that sort of powered and fueled the development of the American economy as we know it now, we should think about the cotton industry. So that's sort of where that has come from. And I think it is a good lens through which we can engage in many of these discussions.
You have a paper called Race, Surveillance, and Resistance. And one of the things you argue in that paper, which is about your hometown of Baltimore, which seems very special to you, is that some of the forms of surveillance that are visible in Baltimore as just an exemplar American city, which would include airplane surveillance, CCTV cameras, cell phone monitoring, traffic compliance camera monitoring, facial recognition, social media monitoring, and the rest. You say this is a new version of an old set of phenomena that includes the slave catchers and corrections and monitoring militants during the 60s. So you take it all the way back to enslavement. What is this parallel you see between, for example, the slave catchers and planes flying over Baltimore taking pictures of Black neighborhoods?
Really, really good question. And sort of to give context for this this paper that can be found on SSRN. If you want to look it up and download it, that'd be great. So when I wrote that paper, I was in the middle of writing that paper. Initially, I started because I was at this point where I still am. I became very fascinated with reading slave narratives, and I was reading a number of narratives of people who had escaped enslavement on the Underground Railroad, and sort of the ability of them to have hope, to even in an extremely oppressive, deafening system, to have the hope, to have the bravery to set out and chart a new course for their lives. And in the middle of thinking about that, I was sort of wrestling with that, and also the idea that, in many urban cities like Baltimore, the policing surveillance apparatus is deep. You think about the use of stingrays in terms of cell phone surveillance. You think about the use of newer technologies like facial recognition technologies. You think about the use of social media monitoring and the like. And in the middle of sort of wrestling with those things and writing this paper, the summer of 2020 happened, which added even more depth to my thinking there. But I thought that sort of looking back, the more I look back, the more I dug into history and thinking about surveillance practices as mechanisms of control, as mechanisms of power, as mechanisms of exploitation and extraction, I saw so many similarities with today. And I think when we look back, when we make those connections, it can illuminate potential avenues for moving forward today. So and sort of making a connection between the slave catchers surveilling those who are enslaved versus policing practices today, they're all, I sort of liking them to facilitating a racial hierarchy, right? Where those at the bottom are exploited, those at the bottom are preyed upon for economic benefit. And we see that today when I talk about data as the new cotton, in a paper that I'm currently working on that Professor Allen is referencing, I talk about it specifically in the criminal justice context and rely upon some of the work that I've seen in the field. I didn't mention, but I was a longtime public defender. I worked in the criminal justice system for a long time. But sort of seeing, for example, in New York City, the first residential rollout of the use of facial recognition technology was experimented with in a majority Black apartment complex, right? So sort of where do we situate the locations for using these technologies, right? I think about in the context of Baltimore and the use of aerial surveillance practices. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with it, but in 2016, for nearly 10 months, almost an entire year, the city of Baltimore Police Department was engaging in aerial surveillance and these sophisticated planes using military technology and capability, surveilling the entire city without anyone knowing about it, right? This was the Baltimore City Police Department working hand in hand with philanthropists who gave money, millions, to run these planes without the mayor, without the city council, without residents even knowing that they were being surveilled. Later, when data was pulled, looked at sort of the aerial flight paths and the data that was being captured, obviously, just like in the context of Stingray, this was mostly using that surveillance measure to police, monitor, surveil Black communities. So you see those overlaps throughout time.
So in my work, I talk about some of these same issues around surveillance, policing, social control, exploitation of African Americans, but I do it through the lens of data privacy law primarily. And I have concluded that the data privacy law we've got is not very effective in addressing these problems. I have come up with a a framework that I call the Black Opticon, which is the ways in which African Americans are especially vulnerable to discrimination when they go online. There's a panoptic dimension of African Americans being subject to extremes of being watched as they move about online. There's something that I borrow from a European philosopher, the panopticon, which is the ways in which, in a discriminatory manner, African Americans are pushed to the side. They're excluded from opportunities for loans or housing or dating or that sort of thing. And then what I call the conopticon, I made that one up myself, the conopticon, the way in which Blacks and also Hispanics and Asians are subjected to watchfulness that's aimed at targeting vulnerable groups for exploitation, sort of Ponzi schemes and false promises of education and criminal protection. So I wondered whether this idea of the Black Opticon resonates with either of you. And I would like to add before you answer that this wonderful scholar, Simone Brown, who both of you know her work, she suggests that the panopticon metaphor is tired. And we should put Jeremy Bentham back in the, put him back in the closet where he belongs. We don't need Jeremy Bentham. But I actually continue to use the panopticon metaphor and variations on it, riffs on it in my work. Even most recently, I thought that this idea she talks about in her book, Black Matters, of the synopticon, which is the way in which people, including African Americans, seek out attention. So it's not about wanting to be protected from it, but we seek out attention because we want to be the influencers or the popular people at school or the most cited scholar, et cetera. So I just wonder whether you think it has the panopticon metaphor and all its variations outlived its usefulness, or do you think there's still some helpfulness to that idea?
You want to? Well, so yes and no. Is that an answer? So I think there is a place, but I think we need new frameworks. I think we need new modes of thinking. We need new language. We need new vocabulary. I was thinking about sort of the efforts that are being taken now through the White House's Office of Science and Technology to gather information around sort of potentially putting forth a digital Bill of Rights, and they talk about algorithmic, bias, right? And I'm like, is that the best language to use, right? But I think along those lines, I certainly agree with your argument and in your beautiful paper, The Black Opticon, and I think that one of the most compelling aspects of your argument is sort of critiquing traditional, privacy frameworks. And I think our imagination is so captured by this idea of like data privacy, right? And whenever there is a new digital or data or tech issues, we're thinking about it through data privacy. And I'll give you an example. I've been really, really interested in what's been happening in schools over the last couple of years in response to mass school shootings. And one of the areas in which I worked in for a number of years was around, school education policy. And what a number of schools have been doing in the wake of these seemingly continual, perpetual mass school shootings is turning to technology as a way to prevent mass school shootings, right? So if you go to a school expo now, which I recently went to one, you'll see a number of things. You won't see the majority of vendors there, selling pencils and notebooks and things. You'll see people selling bulletproof doors. You'll also see tech companies advertising social media monitoring. You'll see camera companies advertising facial recognition technology. So what recently took place in upstate New York, in the Buffalo area. Does that count as upstate New York?
Yeah.
I don't know my New York geography. So in Buffalo, in the school district in Buffalo, they proposed rolling out facial recognition technology cameras in their school as a way to respond to the threat of mass school shootings, right? And when parents, ACLU and a couple of other organizations began to raise questions around why do we need these cameras? Are they really effective? Like, will they actually prevent a mass school shooting? Should we be focusing on gun control? And instead, the response from the school district and the state was one couched in this philosophy of data privacy, the idea that, well, we gave consent forms to the parents and they sign off on it. You know, these other traditional principles of data privacy, of how we think about it, sort of notice and choice, right? We gave them notice, we gave them choice, they signed off on it, they agreed to it, right? And I think that something is lost there in using those traditional frameworks, because there are so many other questions that we aren't answering. And I sort of think about promoting as an additional framework, sort of to say, like, the idea of data justice, right? Sort of asking the additional questions, right? Like, who will be most burdened by the introduction of these sorts of cameras, right? What are the socio-political, economic questions and drivers and mechanisms behind the introduction of these policies, right? I think sort of using the old modes and frameworks in and of themselves just to respond to these great questions is not sufficient, and we need new modes of thinking.
And you're absolutely right that for a lot of listeners, they hear privacy policy and they assume you mean notice and consent. And so unless we can reshape what people understand privacy to be, right, we have to be cautious in over-relying upon privacy concepts. And I noticed that in the index of your book, privacy is not an indexed term. Fascinating. A book about race and technology and surveillance that does not index the word privacy. So clearly, in your thinking, privacy is not where it's at. It's something else. What is that something else that you think we need to be putting our mind to?
Yeah, it is. You know, I tend to agree with CHAZ in that I think that privacy tends to be a little, I'm not sure what the word is, opaque, implicit for my taste, to talk about what it is I think we should really be talking about, which is the ways and reasons in which Black folks in particular, Black and brown folks more broadly, are always the folks that accrue the most harms of technology, right? And so there's something about, and this goes back to the book and some prior work early in my career where I was doing work in the political arena, political elections, and talking a lot about racial messages and sort of implicit and explicit messages and so forth. One of the things I wanted to get through in the book was a way to talk about that moment in the 1960s where there was, at least in my reading, no implicitness, no accidental bias type of action going on. It was very upfront. Here are people who pose a threat. Here are people who are trying to gain access to power, and we cannot let that happen. And as we think about how we then marshal these new technological tools, they then become the problems that our tools get designed to solve. And so I've made this statement before that with the problem with being a problem and being persistently seen as a problem is that you always become the object of anything that holds itself out as a solution, right? And so any of these proliferation of new technologies at their base always seem to come back to, here's a problem, or here's a fix to your problem of crime or threats in schools or what have you. So I think that in my way, privacy is a little bit too soft of a language to talk about something that I think is much more explicit in terms of the overall motivations behind our technological tools and how we develop and deploy them.
Thank you. I'm trying in my most recent work to respond to the concern that you used the word opaque, and I was glad you used that word because a lot of people find privacy discourse to be opaque, and the opacity is a deterrent to using it. It's also a way to say, oh, we can't talk about privacy because it's just too vague and obscure. But what I'm focusing on now is what I call critical definitional facilitation, which is that you don't get obsessed with the word. You focus on what is the problem that folks are talking about that needs to be solved, and we can address that problem. Which I think it's consistent with your concerns about the justice issues being the fundamental issues.
Yeah, and I do think in that particular way, privacy is useful because it speaks to the stuff that makes us in the world, right? From those digital traces of our consumption as we move through online spaces to our personal information, our eyes, our faces, our hands, fingerprints, all those things are fundamentally us, and we have that sort of right to own and control us. And so I think in that way, privacy is useful because it is a way to think about that control mechanism and who has ownership and the freedom to put ourselves where we want to be at a particular time and moment and have control over how we are and move in and out of the world.
Can I jump in? Can I jump in on that?
Yeah. We're going to get to the audience quickly, soon, but let's go right ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say that I agree with that, and I think it's so important to think about how we define privacy, and the way that we think about, understand, and conceptualize privacy shapes the world in which we can imagine responses to privacy issues, violations, and concerns. I think about this in the context of your work, Professor Allen, in the Black Opticon, where you look at these new consumer privacy bills that are being passed around the country, and raise questions about whether they can respond to, sort of the targeted, racialized aspects of predatory behaviors online. Another, thing that I would add to that, because I think about this in the criminal context so much, is that with all of these new consumer privacy bills that are being passed, almost every single one of them has a carve out for law enforcement purposes, right?
Yes.
So when I think about, so if you're defining privacy as just sort of, whether or not this, Amazon is capturing your data, or whether Google has your location data and whether or not they give you a privacy clause and you can opt in or opt out, that's a very limited view of privacy, right? I would also think about it in the context of like Ring doorbell cameras, right? And how can we get at that action of police officers being able to crowdsource surveillance to a certain extent and get around Fourth Amendment protections under these new consumer privacy bills? We can't.
We can't
right?
get to AI under most of them. We can't get to the most of the issues of surveillance we're talking about today. Yeah. We can't get through these statutes. Okay, so we have a microphone on a stand by the window, and we'd love to have people ask questions of the panel. So please, I welcome anyone to ask a question who would like to.
Or we can ask you all questions.
Or we can ask you all questions. Right. You want to? I think for purposes of everyone hearing, it's great to use the mic if you don't mind.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm just wondering about your opinion on what are the effects or the observable consequences of having Black, brown, and minority developers, software developers in the industry? Like, what are the main benefits or what are the observable, consequences?
Right. So there's a general sense, right, that if we have more gender diversity and more racial and ethnic diversity among software developments, people in the industry, that will get better products. But I'd like to let Charlton answer that question because he's actually studied that a little bit. Yeah,
it's a great question. And, one of the takeaways from a lot of my work really is that representation matters, but it matters in a context, right? So I think what we've seen historically, to the degree that there's been in any movement in terms of diversifying the technology workforce, it's always been at that sort of bottom level, right? As is the case in sort of capitalist economies. And so our frontline technicians and data processors and folks like that. And so I think that also matters, that people have access to an industry and so forth. But I think the real key is about decision making, right? And it's a question really about power. And so representation matters to the degree that there is power. And for me, that power is really codified in the ability to say yes or no, right? And so I think that is where we really see our greatest gap in these tech companies, right? And so one of the things over the last few years that I've had the great fortune of is meeting a lot of Black and brown folks that are working in tech companies, very much conscious of the failings of technologies, often even the failings of their own companies that they're working for, and striving to overcome that. But you start to hear a familiar refrain, right? Even if I have a team that is very diverse, or even primarily folks of color, as sometimes is the case, and I identify a problem, it never quite gets beyond the, maybe we can see about tweaking this or that, right? And so what I think we really need to think about in terms of what are our goals when we're thinking about representation in the tech workforce and so forth, is really at that sort of C-suite level. Who is going to be the person or team of folks able to say, we are not pursuing this technology anymore, right? That's what we need. And I think we magnify the problem even more when we think about representation, when we look out in tech companies and see where do we have not just an individual, even though in most we don't have that, but where you have groups of people who are able to make those decisions collectively, and have that be the law of the company, essentially.
I'd like to actually take your question and like resituate it in the legal professional context for a second. Like, does it matter whether or not legislators, lawmakers are diverse if we want to have laws that are more responsive to the problems of surveillance and oppression we've been talking about today? I was looking at this question very carefully in relationship to the state of Virginia, which, as you know, was one of the states of the Confederacy and has a very large population of African Americans. So the people who introduced the recent Virginia consumer privacy law that will go into effect in January of, I guess that's next month, goes into effect next month. The people who introduced it were an African American, he was the primary sponsor, he had a South Asian co-sponsor, and he had a mixed race person co-sponsor. So I thought, wow, I'm gonna see in Virginia, unlike in California and Utah and Colorado, I'm gonna see a statute that's responsive to African American issues, people of color issues. But instead, I think the Virginia statute is one of the weaker state statutes that have been enacted so far. And when I read about the sponsors' views about the statute, they understand that it doesn't go far enough, that it's seen as a pro-industry statute, friendly to big tech statute. They had to compromise, this is the Derek Bell theory, interest conversion. They had to compromise quite a bit to get anything passed. And they therefore decided to put it to the future, the problems of AI and so forth, and just deal with some basic little notice and consent type privacy protections for the people of Virginia. Not a waste of time, but it's not like having people of color, in places of authority and power means you automatically get the solutions you need to your problems. And it's something which we need to sort of think more about, and how to utilize our power and our authority and our positions as people of color more effectively, knowing that with such positions often come extremes of accountability and compromise that really undercut our ability to do what we would most like to do.
Now, I'll quickly add on. We've all spoke to the question, but I'll just say very, very quickly. Anecdotally, I think some of the observable facts is you have a whole chorus of people saying that, you know, and whenever a story breaks, that if we had someone of color here, this wouldn't have happened. And I think that's true, but I'm not quite sure, right? And I think about most recently the AI rapper that had a record deal and then they took away the record deal. Are you familiar with that? Look it up. What was the rapper's FN Mecca or something like that, right? It's this white appearing AI voiced by a black guy that's like dropping the N-word and all of these things. Obviously the developers of this person, not black, right? And there were, you know, a bunch of questions where would this have gone through if you had black people at the table there. The other thing that you sort of get the benefit of, and I agree with what has been said about, like, you need real power and institutional changes. Obviously, I think about that in the policing context, because you have, you know, black and brown police, but you still have the same sort of policing issues. But one of the other effects in having more black and brown in the tech space is that you get all of these different new insights into how tech is operating. And I'm thinking about some of the work that is being done around like CAS and tech, right? So that, you know, and some of those debates that are taking place, and this beautiful literature that is developing there. So when you have more people at the table, you start having these you know, questions around how, you know, people, depending upon which boxes you check, experience technology, and I think that's a good thing.
Yes, sir.
Hi there. My name is Denai Metaxa. I'm an assistant professor in computer science here, and I study algorithmic content and marginalized people's experiences with it, so kind of similar to what you were just saying. This spring, I'm going to be teaching a seminar course to graduate students and advanced undergrads about the topic is algorithmic justice. And I want to go beyond, you know, what we usually see in a computer science curriculum, which maybe at best will say, here are some really high profile examples of problematic algorithms. We can see that they are biased if we look at the numbers. And so, you know, fairness bias, like, there you go. I'm looking really to get more into, to expose a group of computer science students to more literature outside of our discipline about these kinds of topics that really is sort of more incisive and to the point about the societal structures that they play into, the histories and so on. And so I was wondering if you had sort of themes, specific events, readings, kind of ideas that you think you would like to expose that sort of group of students to, if you could.
We'll go ahead and start because it's a good moment to plug some new stuff from the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies, which just a couple of weeks ago put out what we call the People's Guide to I've forgotten the rest of the name now, but algorithmic bias. And essentially what it does, so if you go to criticalracedigitalstudies.com, you can find it there very, very easily. So it goes through a number of, you know, just sort of the bullet points. What is bias and the various permutations and names. Then it goes deeply into several case studies ranging from credit to risk scoring algorithms and the like, about 7 or 8 different case study applications. Go beyond that and look at the code base for these particular case studies. And then I think what is the most powerful part of that in some ways is the tremendous literature base that surrounds all of this. So it's a deep dive through all of the folks that are pioneers, who are contemporary writers writing on various aspects of algorithmic discrimination and similar topics. And so it's a great, I think, resource, and it's written sort of both at all levels. So it would be great for students that have, computing background, but it's also particularly in the language around the, where race, discrimination, algorithms, and all those things meet. It's a layperson's guide, so it's an easy entry point into that if that's not been your orientation.
There are still a remarkably few book-length discussions of these issues. I think we're really at a turning point, and that there's been, I would call it, an explosion of writing about race and tech in the last 5 to 10 years. But still, we're at stage one, and we need to be moving on. So lots of people have things, I think, in the works. And hopefully there'll be more coming along. If you email me, I'll send you the reading list for my course on privacy and racial justice. And CHAZ ARNETT and I are on a team of people who are trying to develop a legal textbook related to surveillance, privacy, data protection, and justice around race, and maybe that might be helpful to you as well. Some of that, as we get that project moving along, some of that material might be helpful to you as well. But thank you for the question. Yes.
Sorry, I was just going to say you can email me too. I'll send you my syllabus.
I want to go back to an example that Chaz, you raised about Baltimore in 2016. And first of all, I'd just be interested to know what it meant to survey the whole city and what exactly was being looked for and what that type of surveillance project would involve. But you made an observation that I thought was really important, which is that the mayor and other members of the city government were not even aware that it was happening. And I think that that's a reminder that so much of surveillance happens at what Foucault calls the infra-law level, beneath the law. It's being decided by people who are not elected lawmakers or official lawmakers, and it's happening in the micro politics of everyday life that sort of escape legal regulation. You think about the surveillance that goes on at a university like Penn. I'm sure there's many laws on the Pennsylvania state books about how universities have to be organized, to be accredited, to how many courses they have to offer, how their admissions should work to be fair and so forth. But I doubt they have rules about where the camera should go, or what type of grading system people need to use, or what type of a D card system people should use. And so a lot of the surveillance we're getting confronted with is on this micro infra-law level. I'm just curious what that means in the bigger picture for combating it. Can it only be about statutes and changing the laws, or does there have to be a micro-political solution as well?
Yes, it has to be beyond sort of law, case law, legislation. It has to be those sort of localized political debates as well. But you raise a really, really good point. The sort of coming back to how that took place. It was the Arnold Foundation that gave money for the aerial surveillance that was taking place. And if anyone knows anything about the Arnold Foundation,
This is a Texas-based family foundation.
Yes, yeah. And they've funded sort of criminal justice practices and responses across the country, different cities, whether it's use of electronic ankle monitors or other things. But aerial surveillance has been a big thing that they were funneling money into, and it's part of what I have a paper that I'm working on now, and so wrestling with my thoughts on, and I mentioned it earlier, this idea of crowdsourcing surveillance, right? And specifically from the state policing aspect, where it's manifesting in a couple of ways, right? One is in the context where you have people who are outside of a jurisdiction just funneling money into developing surveillance technology, right? So the crowdsourcing is coming from without. There are other cities like Newark, New Jersey, that have set up a surveillance network within the city, and they basically turn to the public and say, hey, these cameras are publicly available. Can you do your citizen, duty and hop on and, watch for a couple of minutes, right? Crowdsourcing in that sense, turning to the public. And then in the third way in which I see this manifesting is in the context in which I mentioned it earlier, through the use of personal individual cameras in which police officers get access to, right? And sort of balloon this surveillance network. But I think in the ways that we respond to these practices, there has to be litigation, right? In Baltimore, that practice was challenged by the ACLU. They ultimately won a case, right? But the interesting thing about it, it was a case that came out of Baltimore at the federal district level. The judge, and I'm sort of giving you the general of the case. The judge essentially said that these cameras, they fly for 10 to 12 hours a day. Sort of the data that they're pulling is just it's just pixelated images. It's not very clear. This isn't really the sort of privacy violation that we think is a threat to the Constitution. So it was rejected. It goes to the Fourth Circuit, and the Fourth Circuit judges have a totally different perspective on it, right? They say that it doesn't matter how clearly or grainy the image is, right? The idea that you can follow someone for extended time periods and sort of put it together in this mosaic way and sort of draw pictures about what people do, where they work, where they go to, what may be their medical ailments or what may be their social proclivities, et cetera, is an extreme violation of how we think about Fourth Amendment protections. And there, I think it's interesting because you have two separate courts coming to different conclusions, and me wrestling with that, I said the only difference is the makeup of the court, right? So what do we do about that? I think that's part of the work Professor Allen is pulling me into. We talk about developing a casebook, but I sort of see my work in scholarship, my work in teaching for the law students that are here, and in developing materials as sort of this way of having an impact and influence on those who will ultimately potentially sit on a bench, right? Or those who are drafting legislation. And in my advocacy work, it's sort of preparing the people on the ground for those micro political, advocacies and debates to have the proper language, to have the proper frameworks, to be able to engage in a robust discussion there. And I think we have to come at it from all different angles.
This idea of the private sector and the public sector working together, like under the scope of law, some sort of other realm. Also Baltimore, and Chaz knows this case very well, but during the Freddie Brown protests in Baltimore, the police were working with a private company called Geophedia, which was working with social media companies like Meta and Twitter to get real-time location information about the people who were attending the protests. And then the police could attempt to undermine the effectiveness of the protests by going and arresting people who had outstanding warrants on trivial problems, trivial things, and as a way to deter people from engaging in protest, right? And so it's very powerful when private sector actors become tools of policing to undercut the interests of African Americans and other groups in being able to peacefully protest against violence. And in that case, though, it wasn't the courts that shut it down. It was shame that shut it down. When the world learned, I guess the ACLU helped there too, but when it was learned that this was going on, the major social media companies just pulled out of the program because they were embarrassed that they were caught up in something that was so obviously offensive. Hi there.
Hello there.
Hello there.
Hi. Haven't seen you in a long time. It's wonderful to see you.
It's great to see you.
And it's wonderful to see everyone on stage. So, I have a question that's really about how the overall conversation applies to gender and what the gender implications are in particular. So if we're talking about encoding race, we can't do so obviously without looking at women of color within these various communities. And so what are some of the gender dimensions, and in particular, as more states roll back reproductive rights protections in particular, and there are issues of surveillance of women seeking services of various types, whether we need to be concerned with how that surveillance takes place with regard to very gender-specific issues?
Well, I had spent a huge amount of my career writing about gender issues as they relate to privacy and especially in the healthcare context, but also just more generally. And I'm glad you raised the issue. Because I've spent so much time on gender, and I think not nearly enough time on race, I'm in my headspace right now is focusing on race. But of course, there's that intersectional point that race is gender, gender is race. This is not going to be directly responsive to what you said, but I just want to say this because I think it might be interesting to the audience and maybe hopefully to you as well. But I start my entire project when it comes to race and privacy with a case that involves a woman. So, enslaved woman in the South who has been shot by a man who hired her out, he's criminally prosecuted by the white people for having shot her without good justification. He appeals his prosecution, his conviction, to the Supreme Court of North Carolina, and the Supreme Court of North Carolina says that, unfortunately, we can't punish this man because we can't interfere with the privacy of the master-slave relationship, state versus man, 1820-ish. And so there's always been this way in which the experiences of Black women have shaped and been shaped by how Americans think about privacy. And because then the case after that one in North Carolina was where a white man beat his white wife, and she tried to get justice, and the court said, oh, we can't interfere with the privacy of the domestic relationship, the husband-wife relationship. So there's that. But there are these other ways in which women of color have had this amazingly positive role in growing the privacy law that we do like. So a woman named Dory Mapp was the woman whose house was searched by the police without a proper search warrant, and her case before the Supreme Court, which she was brave enough to stick it in there to the very end and go to the Supreme Court, her case established the exclusionary rule under which the police may not use, prosecutors may not use in court evidence collected in violation of the Fourth Amendment. And then the brave mixed race woman who is behind Loving versus Virginia, who brought to the Supreme Court the issue of interracial marriage and prevailed in the Supreme Court. So often, and these are just almost like random examples, there are many, many women of color and Black women who have been in the vanguard of pushing against various kinds of surveillance, privacy invasion, and related wrongs. And I'm very glad about that. And I'm in my more recent work, I'm connecting the role of women to the improvement of and forward movement in privacy law and policy. So it's there, and we need to, I think, to be more to mine it more. When it comes to things like abortion, birth control, trans women, and other issues that relate to women, it's very important from the point of view of justice that we get those matters right. And the Dobbs case was such a blow because it set us back in a world in which it looked like we had a more or less a permanent right to make choices about abortion. Suddenly we don't. It's now left to the states. It's left to the whims of the state. Abortion law is in disarray across the nation. We don't know what our rights are in half the states yet. And so that's an important concern. But women are also on the front lines of things like policing too. I mean, Breonna Taylor was shot in her own home, coming out of her own bedroom by police officers who didn't respect her and who didn't see her body as as important enough to give the courtesy of a proper knock and entry into her home. So Black women like Black men, so Black women like Freddie Gray or Trayvon Martin or George Floyd are being killed and are victims of policing abuses. So it's all, to me, connected, and we need to, as we tell these stories and develop these perspectives on software or policing or software and policing, we need to be mindful that sometimes the people whose lives are at stake are women. In fact, probably half the time, the people whose lives are at stake are women.
And I'll just add that when in thinking about, because that's at the forefront of my mind, I'm actually in the midst of organizing a workshop next semester focused on challenging carceral surveillance practices. And one of the things that we're planning to talk about, and this is connected to, I've written a lot about the use of electronic ankle monitors as a detention jail alternative that we've heard throughout a number of states and jurisdictions that that data that is available to the state, to the court, to prosecutors may be used to prosecute those seeking abortions using that location data. So that's something at the forefront of my mind, and it's really interesting that the Roe and Dobbs were like battled on privacy grounds, right? And a conception of privacy that's from the male gaze, right? There's been recently there's been a flurry of writing and literature and scholarship in the area of sort of critical technology and feminism. I was reading a piece not too long ago, because this upcoming semester I teach my race, tech, and law class. I'm going to have a class focused squarely on technology and feminism. There's a Afro-feminist critique of like technology, which I found to be very fascinating. I'm forgetting the author's name at the moment, but I think those like Sophia Noble and others are really leading the charge and sort of thinking about technology in that intersectional way and giving voice to the insights that women, particularly women of color, can bring to these discussions.
Yeah, and that reminds me that this book by Simone Brown that we referenced a couple of times here, Dark Matters, she describes, and I'm a philosopher, with a PhD, and I didn't know this story about Jeremy Bentham and the origins of the panopticon, but she says that when he was writing the letters that led to the idea of the panopticon as a device of social control, he was on a ship that had a cargo of Black women. And it's quite possible that thinking about how do you manage to control all these bodies, with limited resources, was the spark that might have led to him develop the idea of the panopticon, which we now said we have to move beyond. But that's I think an important sort of perspective that she brings onto this set of issues. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I really appreciate just kind of this longer history of racial capitalism and its relationship to tech that y'all have been able to kind of weave for us together. I really feel like it is so much in conversation with Simone Brown's work, Ruha Benjamin's work, all of those folks. And so I wanted to ask basically kind of the role of this like data extraction, going a little bit deeper on racial capitalism, the role of data extraction that it plays, whether that's in ankle monitors or whether that's in, the police or like the phone call costs in prisons. And I think it's really easy sometimes to talk about tech and have a kind of teleology with it, that this has always been the way that things are. And I really appreciated kind of bringing tech back to the 60s and the 65 bill. And so I'm really curious within both of and all three of y'all's kind of historical breadth, were there other moments that you saw that where another possibility was possible that would have offered a different kind of vision of what might have been instead of this relationship of tech and surveillance that is so prevalent and so crucial in the ways that we've contested today. So
Yeah, I'll take that first. Thank you for the question, which is what I love, and I always come back to. There's a piece in my book or a section where I talk about this, and I over and over again for the last probably 5 years since I've discovered it, continue to mine it. It is an op-ed in 1967 by Roy Wilkins, who was a longtime head NAACP, civil rights activist, and turns out to be one of the folks, as leaders of the civil rights movement, that was really captivated by new computing technology and wrote about it significantly. And so there's this piece that's titled Computerize the Race Problem. And I will go through all of it. I'll skip right to the end, which is what I think is so important about what he tried to do. And basically what he said was, he took a historical look in talking about slavery, sharecropping, Jim Crow, the ways in which Black folks had always tried to challenge and take hold of power in some way, socially, economically, et cetera. And even trying to play by the rules of, you work hard, you play by the rules, you get elevated, and seeing time after again, when you did that, you were still slapped down and put back and so forth. And so he dovetails that into emerging computing technology and talking about what is the fate of Black workers, Black laborers, at a moment when we're already behind. And then he finishes this piece really asking a question, and it says something like, does the computer have to be essentially a way to measure Black people's lag in the economy, how far they are behind? Or can it be our way to interracial justice and peace? And so I'm doing a bad job of paraphrasing, but essentially what he was doing was asking a different question, which I think was so important, which was not the question that had already been asked, which is, how do we deal with this emerging threat of Black people?
Right.
And computers and computing technology becomes the answer to it. But his was a more open-ended one that started with, how can this new powerful thing help us reach our ideals of human equality and equal opportunity? And so I think that's one of those alternative paths. And it's, in a lot of ways, it's simple because it's really just about asking a different question, a different starting point that then lends itself to all kinds of possible futures. But obviously we chose not to ask that question, and we've seen and reaped the results of that.
And in the first few books written by legal scholars and sociologists about the computer age and the problems that it poses for privacy and surveillance, all written by white men, there's scant reference to race in any of these important books, like Alan Weston's Privacy and Freedom, or works by Arthur Miller and a few other lawyers. And I've looked at those texts and collected them to see what was being said about race and privacy in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in the 1970s. So Vance Packer has a little bit about race in his book, but the recognition that Black people experience special threats around privacy due to policing was a well-known issue in the 1950s. It was not a secret, right? The idea that psychological testing as being conducted in employment spaces was biased against African Americans and used to keep African Americans out of jobs was a well-known phenomenon of the period. And yet there was just very, very limited running with that idea. No foregrounding of the problems of African Americans in those eras. So I think that there's not, you ask about, were there moments when things could have been different? I think that having recognized the problems, some of those brilliant minds could have been put to trying to foreground the concerns of African Americans. One other thing, going back to the beginning of the 20th century, before technology, but not, way before technology, 1906, state of Georgia, a case called Passage versus New England Life Insurance Company, which has the distinction of being the very first state Supreme Court case to find that there is such a thing as a right to privacy. The judge who's writing the opinion says in its case about whether newspapers can publish advertisements that have people's photographs in them without their consent. Well, the judge says, no, that's an invasion of privacy. We should recognize that in our law. And then he says that when a person's image is used without his consent, he is to that extent like a slave to a merciless master. So Georgia Supreme Court Justice in 1906, analogizing invasions of privacy to slavery, that could have been a moment, right? That could have been a moment when the seriousness of privacy invasions could have been taken in a whole different direction than Louis Brandeis took it a few years later, right? In terms of, police surveillance of telephone calls in white people's houses, right? Something way more profound could have been done than just associating, privacy as, the most celebrated value of civilized society. How about let's get to the coercion and the control and the oppression that privacy assaults can represent? That we missed that moment.
Yeah. Thank you. It's such an interesting question. Thank you. And we're all pointed at different points in time. So this is fantastic. And I imagine, well, I hope not. That wouldn't be good 50, 100 years now that we were like, could have been now, right? But so in my paper, Race, Surveillance, Resistance, I sort of hint at this idea, and in a forthcoming paper called Black Lives Matter, that's coming out soon, I go into a little deeper on this idea, and a colleague of mine sort of makes a similar argument in the First Amendment context. I do it in the Fourth Amendment context, and the argument is around Reconstruction and this idea of, with the passing of the new amendments at the time of Reconstruction, that essentially the country was engaging in a second founding or a new founding of America, right? And William Carter is the colleague that I'm referring to at University of Pittsburgh, and he's written a paper thinking about sort of how this applies in the First Amendment context. But the argument that he makes in this second founding is that not only was the second founding this point in which we put forth these new amendments for greater protections, recognizing the rights that we want to delineate and things that we do not want to allow, but it was also considered, and he goes through a bunch of texts, and during the time, it was also considered a moment in that new founding that we would take the voices of those who could not speak at the initial founding into consideration moving forward, right? And with that being said, he says that at that point in time during Reconstruction, with that second founding, we should have taken the thoughts, the opinions, the voices, the experiences of those Native, Indigenous folks, those who have been enslaved, into how we think about these concepts that we infuse in these new constitutional amendments, and we did not, and that was a moment that we could have. He goes on, speaks to what that means in the First Amendment context. I talk about what it means in the Fourth Amendment context, right? And I think it's big and it's profound, right? Because under the Fourth Amendment, we have these limitations in how we can use that amendment to protect against police surveillance, right? Mm-hmm. The idea that it has to be government action. If it's not government action, then the Fourth Amendment doesn't come into play, right? Well, what does that mean for a company like Ring doorbells that are, taking data and then feeding it to the police officers. Like, can we address those middlemen? And then also the notion that the distinction that is made under the Fourth Amendment between things that happen in the public versus things that happen in private, right? And this notion that you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy if you're doing things out in the public. Now, if we took sort of the perspectives of and the voices and experiences of those who were enslaved indigenous folks, the greatest threat, while the founders were, worrying about sort of writs from, the monarchy, indigenous and Black folks were worrying about, private citizens, right? Not the government, not the monarchy, et cetera, right? So in thinking about the Fourth Amendment, that they would speak their experience to that Fourth Amendment being able to work, not just when there's government action, but when there's private action. Also for folks of color, they would infuse that the experiences in the Fourth Amendment to say that it's not just, shouldn't just be focused, you shouldn't be considered not to have a reasonable expectation of privacy in public, because being in public is always been a dangerous thing for people of color. You think about, just hashtag living while Black and all of the episodes that take place. So I would say that during Reconstruction, when we supposedly embarked on that second founding, that was a moment in which we could have created greater protections that would have fortified how we think about the uses of surveillance technologies now and the protections that we have under our constitutional order.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're going to wrap things up. We're just about out of time, and I guess I want to end by asking our panelists whether they're going to be Afro pessimists or Afro optimists. So at the end of your book, Black Software, this is where I want to kind of end the conversation. You say, very last sentence, whether we're talking about Black people's relationship with the police, our relationship with technology, or the overlap between the two, can we ever outrun our history? Can we ever outrun our history?
It's a tough question. That's why I left it that way. I'm constantly going back through it. I am almost always pessimistic because of, I think, just the legacy of what we have already built and the prospect of undoing that to even move ourselves forward. So I'm always stuck. I'm a pessimist because the task seems so great. I'm not sure that the will is present to meet that challenge. So that's my usual stance. But I'm going to try to channel my inner Ruha Benjamin, who we often confront each other on this and talking about pessimism and optimism and where we find reason and places for optimism, which is with people that are passionate and in the struggle. And that's a lot of folks who are pushing back, who are identifying these problems in everyday circumstance in which they emerge, building projects, programs, legislation, et cetera, to try to counter it. So I think there is optimism to the degree that we are still engaging this struggle. But I do think the challenge is great to unravel so much of what we have put together.
Can we ever outrun our history?
It's a tough question. A great part of me feels as if I can't afford to be pessimistic, right? All the time, at least, anyway, because that would be a disservice to those who sacrifice so much for getting us to where we are today. But what I'll say, one of the things that gives me hope is sort of seeing the ways in which new groups, new individuals, organizations are using technology in furtherance of social justice. I think it's amazing. It inspires me, sort of in engaging in literature in the area of Afrofuturism and distant futures. Is something that I read on the side, but actually fuels a lot of my thinking in my academic writing as well. And I'll just leave you all with something that I always come back to and think about. So I used to live in Pittsburgh. Professor Allen did too. And a couple of years ago, there was this incident that took place in Pittsburgh, and there was this artist named Alicia Wormsley, if I'm recalling her name correctly, and there was this apartment building that had it is in the East Liberty neighborhood in Pittsburgh, highly gentrified neighborhood. It used to be almost entirely Black. In recent years, it's sort of flipped, and she's an artist. She put up this billboard, and on the billboard, it was just like very simple. It just said, there are Black people in the future, right? And it set off a riot. It set off a riot, right? And eventually the building owner asked her to take it down, and I can't forget seeing that, and I think about that all the time, right? And in many ways, it sort of speaks to the sort of the perseverance of these struggles for justice, and it also speaks to my interest in Afrofuturism. Not that people of color, women, whatever other intersectional boxes you check, we will continue to be there in that future, and not just there and present, but like beautiful architects of what that future is going to be. So that gives me hope and inspiration.
Perfect place to end. Thank you very much, Chaz and Charlton.
Thank you.